Alright, what's up, y'all? You know who it is. It's the Mad Hatter logging back in. The dude y'all love to hate. And we're gonna talk about some more black shit. So, next up to bat is the case of Craig Hodges. If y'all don't know who Craig Hodges is, he was a backup shooting guard for the Chicago Bulls. He was with the Bulls when they won their second championship. You know, Michael Jordan Bulls, considered the greatest team of all time in the NBA. And he was a very outspoken young man at the time. So the controversy is that he went to the White House, you know, as every team does when you win the championship, and they went to the White House, and this was under George H.W. Bush. And what the guy did is, he had his dashiki on at the time, and he was with, he was, of course, with the Nation of Islam, siding more with Louis Farrakhan, and he gave the President of the United States a letter discussing all the major issues in the black community, basically saying, here's what is going on in the black community. Will you listen to it? And this was in 1992, which is at the time 24 years ago, so that is quite a bit of a long time ago. And apparently, according to his lawsuit versus the NBA, apparently that incident couldn't get him hired by any other NBA team, which is crazy to think about. So, this article discusses how at the time he was one of the best three-point shooters, but he was also aging at the time, is what some people say. So I'm going to read some passages from this article from the New York Times called "The Case of Hodges versus the NBA." So let's start with, give me 1 second. So they talk about, this is what the article says. The lawsuit alleges that the incident embarrassed the NBA. It alleges that Hodges' work to curb the breakdown of the African American family with Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam was also seen as inimical by the NBA. And if you guys don't know what inimical means, that means hostile, or not necessarily agreeing with, or confrontational. It goes on to say, as was Hodges' public criticism of, quote, African American professional athletes who failed to use their considerable wealth and influence to assist the poor and disenfranchised. So this has me thinking about a lot of different issues, especially Michael Jordan. I'm very much a critic of Michael Jordan with the cost of his shoes and how the black community is so focused on his shoes and how he invests a lot of money in private prisons, which disproportionately affects black people. The prison industry does. So my criticism of Michael Jordan, I can go on and on about that. But reading this makes me think a little bit differently about Michael, and maybe, especially with this guy being a part of his team, maybe Michael was aware of how the NBA was at that time, being a big business, and being a business especially of many black men, how careful black men had to be about being too political at the time. So it does make me think about the Michael Jordan situation in a much different light. But let's continue to move on. So let's see. Okay, so this is Hodges talking. He says, after the 1992 season, I or my agent had called every team in the NBA, and not one would even not one would even give me a tryout, let alone sign me. This is what he said. So somebody under anonymity said that he was on his last legs as a player. He said that he couldn't guard a post. This is what the anonymous guy is saying. He's also saying, and everyone knew it. So the article is saying, in the last season for the Bulls, Hodges played in only 53 of the team's 82 regular season games. The Bulls signed Trent Tucker, a better defender than Hodges and a higher percentage three-point shooter. Now, this is what we all know. Phil Jackson, champion, he's got like 11 rings right now. So this is Phil Jackson at the time talking about the situation. Phil Jackson says, I thought we improved ourselves there, talking about the Trent Tucker signing over Craig Hodges. Um, Jackson goes on to say, I had the highest regard for Craig, though. He was a great team player, never caused any problems, and I respected his views. I'm a spiritual man, and so is he. But I also found it strange that not a single team called to inquire about him. Usually, I get at least one call about a player we've decided not to sign. And I'm adding this, but especially as a championship winner, right? So back to Phil Jackson. And yes, he couldn't play much defense, but a lot of guys in the league can't. But not many can shoot from his range either. Now, in the lawsuit, they say Billy McKinney, a director player for the Supersonics at the time, who was black, is quoted as saying, so he says about the situation, he couldn't do anything because, quote, brothers have families, if you know what I mean. So that's interesting. Let's see what else. Wayne Embry, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Cleveland Cavaliers. This was at the time this was written. This was like '96. He said, "I've never heard of any conspiracy whatsoever. I'm sure I would have if there was one. And in a league that has about 80% black players, it's hard to charge racism." Now it's funny he says that, being that years later Donald Sterling happens, who was obviously very racist. I don't necessarily believe that Donald Sterling should have been spied on and had his privacy ripped away. That's a whole different conversation. But from what we know, Donald Sterling was racist, and yet he still had a position within the NBA. So this definitely gets rid of the argument that this previous guy had. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I'm gonna say all that to get back to the last point of this article. Is that they talk about this article brings it up to a point. So let me read one more quote really quick before I bring it to a point. One more quote from David Stern, commissioner at the time of the NBA. He said, "The conspiracy is ridiculous." He said, "I was even at the White House when Craig wore that dashiki. I thought it looked great, and I told him so." So that's kind of a moot point. Like, that's kind of a weak point. So I don't even want to get onto that, because David Stern was an interesting guy on his own. But let's get to the whole point. The point that this article talks about is how money and power is everything in the NBA. So the end of this article says, it talks about how how this one guy was saying, it's well known that the league is well known through the league that there may be repercussions if you speak out too strongly on some sensitive issues. This is Buck Williams, a forward for the Knicks at the time. He said, "I don't know if Hodges lost his job because of it, but it is a burden when you carry the militant label that he has." And the article goes on to say, yet such nonconformists as Dennis Rodman and Charles Barkley are tolerated, even celebrated. But that goes to my point that I want to bring it all to a head. That goes to my point about how it's all about money and power. Dennis Rodman and Charles Barkley had power. So the NBA is not going to fuck with them because they don't want to fuck with the hand that's feeding them. Some player who's on the sidelines, some player who's in the peripheral of the league, like Craig Hodges, it's a lot easier to punish him if that's what the NBA did, but it's a lot easier to punish him because nobody's really going to have his back, because who really even knows about Craig Hodges? And he's not bringing the league in the same amount of money that Dennis Rodman and Charles Barkley are. Now, I also want to talk about what's going on a little bit in the WNBA and the NBA right now in 2016. How NBA players are protesting against a lot of the police brutality that we've seen recently against black people. So people like Carmelo Anthony, even Michael Jordan has stepped out now. Kemba Walker, LeBron James, obviously, Dwayne Wade were a part of this. So they're stepping out and they're talking about this. And the NBA is allowing it. I know that under the new commissioner, Adam Silver, it's a little bit different. He's trying to be progressive, but I still think the NBA is like, they're not entirely happy about the black issue because it's so conflicting with cops and white America, right? But you have this whole LGBT positivity, like when the NBA removed the All-Star game from Charlotte. And why did that happen? There's an article from USA Today that I'm going to link into this thing I'm talking about how Rick Welts, he is the president, he is, the Warriors president, Rick Welts, openly gay. He voiced his frustration, right? Last year's NBA champion, not this past year, but the year before that, NBA champion, president of the NBA championship team, popular team. He's not happy with the anti-LGBT bathroom law in North Carolina, so he speaks out. The NBA listens. He is a very influential man, so this is why, in my opinion, that the NBA is a lot more open when it comes to LGBT issues. However, there are not a lot of powerful black commissioners or presidents or owners who are speaking out against this police brutality situation that's happening in the black community. So because of that, they're not going to move as quickly as maybe they would if it was another issue. But to wrap things up, it's all about money and influence today. Carmelo Anthony, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade have all spoken out, and they are top tier athletes. But you had, like where I'm from, Washington D.C., Etan Thomas, he's been pushing for these issues since he's been in the league, but he's more of a D-list player. Not a bad player, but he's not popular, but people don't know about what he's doing, and the league is less likely to back him because he's not bringing in money. So it all comes back to the money. I'm going to leave it there. This is getting hella long. Sorry about that, but I'm ranting, but bam.